We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Bob Moriarty, founder of 321 Gold and 321energy.com. He was also a Marine Corps fighter pilot in Vietnam. Bob, thanks for joining me today.
It's always a pleasure, Tom.
So, Bob, you're all about asking the right questions to find the right answers to many of the situations that we're facing here. So what do you think is a good question to start with to frame what we're facing at the moment?
I think the question is too broad. I think you have to aim more specifically. I believe 2024 is going to be a catastrophic year because there are so many issues at play, all of which could go curvilinear. You've got Ukraine and Russia, you've got Gaza, you've got Iran and Israel, you've got the greater financial crisis, which is right around the corner. So there's so many things that are dangerous, but at the same time, you've got gold and silver that I believe has broken out and is going to go for the next 10 years. It's going to offer a lot of opportunity. So that's the best answer I can come up with.
But we need a question to start with, Bob.
Oh, okay, let's see. Well, okay, let's talk about gold. Everybody loves talking about gold and silver. Who's driving the price of gold and silver?
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to start. There seems to be so many of these catalysts that explain what's happening with the price at this point. It seems like the East is driving a lot of the buying, right? But when we get these geopolitical catalysts, these events, maybe that's a good direction to go in. Do you think that when we get these price pops on this chaos, these conflict-driven, seemingly price pops, are those sustainable? And do we need to maybe consolidate here before we go higher?
I don't think the geopolitical events have much impact at all. When Iran attacked Israel, there was a gold ETF that went up to $3,000 an ounce on Sunday night. And I just went, holy cow, tomorrow is going to be interesting. But even when Israel just attacked Iran, the price of oil was up $3 or $4. The price of gold was up $40 at night, and then it came right back down. The price of oil and the price of gold and silver are certainly sentiment indicators, but I don't think the geopolitical impact has been very much at all. And actually, you should never buy something because you think we're going to go into World War III, because if you're right, it's not going to make any difference. Mm-hmm. But I think we have had years and years and years of sideways movement in gold and silver, and we've broken out, and the sentiment is disastrous, certainly for gold shares, but basically for gold and silver. And every coin dealer in the United States is reporting people are coming in selling their gold and silver. Now, you get that at bottoms. You don't get that at tops. So I think there's more opportunity. I think what we've been talking about for years and years and years is here now. But I think it's sentiment that moves it. However, the main push behind gold, which has just gone up again and again and again and again, is China. And what the Chinese are doing is they're taking control of the gold market for the first time.
So, Bob, we recently saw that gold, Bitcoin, and the Dow were recently, pretty much all at all-time highs. Should that be a warning signal to people?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Those are conflicting investments of a sort. Gold was the last one to the party, but I think that Bitcoin is topping. I think that Nvidia has
Nvidia.
topped.
Mhm.
Yeah, Nvidia. And I think the S&P has topped, and we'll see. I know a lot of money came out of gold ETFs to be put into Bitcoin. The amount of money in cryptocurrencies is staggering to me. It's over $2 trillion, and that's a lot of money.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, Bob, considering, all these conflict escalating price movements, is the price of oil a good example of the market worrying about more conflict here?
Absolutely. I mean, when Israel attacked Iran, it shot up $4. And then when everybody realized it wasn't going to be World War III, it came right back down.
Mhm.
That is absolutely a giant sentiment indicator because Iran has the ability to double or triple the price of oil literally all overnight. All
Mhm.
they have to do is shut down the Gulf of Hormuz. So if you want to know what's going on in that particular war, let's look at the price of oil.
Mhm. So, how important is Iran in the world of oil pricing, and how significant is it that they were attacked by Israel?
That's really two totally different issues. Iran obviously is important because they're a major exporter of oil and they control the Gulf of Hormuz. The real impact of Israel versus Iran, Israel's been the big dog in the Middle East for the last 80 years. And when Iran had that incredibly successful attack on Israel, the balance of power in the Middle East shifted 180 degrees. And that's a good thing because it could mean for the first time in 80 years, we could actually have peace in the Middle East. There has been constant war festering, uh, centered around Israel since 1947, and that's a bad thing. I can't remember what the total number of refugees in the world is. It's like 37 million or something like that. And that's all caused by these constant wars in the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran. Uh, and it's a bad thing for Europe. Europe is just waking up to the fact, hey, wait a minute, we got all these people who are not contributing, who are literally parasites on the system. I'm not against the immigrants. I'm not against Muslims. I'm against whatever it is that create this constant warfare. We don't need the warfare. I was in a war. Nobody ever wins a war. One side loses more than the other. So you got some very interesting dynamics there. I was pleased to see Israel didn't drop any nukes on Iran, didn't make a big attack on Iran. Iran and Israel got together behind the curtain and said, okay, we need to play this down a little bit. We are at an exceptionally dangerous time in history, and it either goes curvilinear into World War III and everybody gets killed, or people sober up, wake up, and start realizing that constant war is not a good thing.
Mhm. Well, Bob, when you're talking about that balance of power shifting and being optimistic that we have peace, how does that square with this escalating conflict?
Oh, well, strange enough, here's the deal. When you walk into a biker bar and you start a fight and you go up to the biggest biker, insult his woman, and then punch him in the mouth and knock him out, everybody looks at you with a lot more respect.
Mhm.
I don't want to mess with that little squirt.
Mhm.
Okay, he's going to knock me out next. Israel's had all the power in the Middle East for the last year because they've had their attack Chihuahua, which is the United States, willing to attack everybody. So we destroyed Libya, we destroyed Syria, we destroyed Iraq. For what? Who's better off? And the answer is nobody. And we got to stop doing that. And strange enough, Iran just showed Israel, you don't want to mess with me. Iran has the ability to destroy Israel. They've got 3,000 missiles and rockets, and Hezbollah has 10,000. And what it means is they just put handcuffs on Israel. Okay. Israel's not going to go whack 3 or 4 generals anytime soon, or they're going to find themselves, their generals, getting whacked. And a balance of power would be a good thing. And if Israel actually had to defend itself rather than depending on the United States, they would be far more reasonable to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and profound point, is that when we have these countries that are, constantly sending aid, constantly sending weapons, it makes for, unfortunately, a far more drawn out conflict, as we've seen, in the Ukraine conflict. But Bob,
let me stop you right there for a minute. Let's go to Ukraine for just a minute. Who is better off? Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Poland? How are these guys better off by going to war with Russia? And the answer is they're not any better off. The German chancellor approved the destruction of a $30 billion oil pipeline, and he gave permission to the United States to blow it up. Now, how is Germany better off? 69% of the companies, manufacturing companies in Germany, have had to move production to other countries because of the cost of energy. And I just read yesterday that Poland is starting to move its companies to Italy. Many of these companies were companies that were moved there from Germany. There's been total chaos in Europe in the last 2 years over a war that was absolutely stupid from the beginning. I cannot think of a dumber war than the Ukrainians dragging Russia into attacking them. It's killed 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers. It's destroyed the economy in the EU. It will end up with the destruction of NATO and perhaps the destruction of the United States. For what? Okay? Because you don't like Russia, because you don't like Putin. There is no law that says you have to like your neighbor. However, there is a law that says you have to get along with your neighbor for a very simple reason. He's your neighbor. Mm-hmm. How is Germany better off by feeding weapons to Ukraine? They're not. Sweden came in and said, okay, we want to send $5 billion to Ukraine. I'm thinking, this is Sweden. Okay. They were neutral in World War II. What has changed that they're not neutral anymore?
No. Go ahead.
Enough on Ukraine.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know, and we look at let's say the incentive structure for that conflict. I don't know that it's necessarily that the Ukraine was the one that wanted to just drag Russia into this war. There seems to be so many more players at that, behind the curtain.
The United States has been at war with Russia since 1945. The worst atrocities committed by the Nazis were on the Eastern Front, but they were not German Nazis, they were Ukrainian Nazis. And after the war, the Ukrainian Nazis moved to the United States and Canada, and you've got to be familiar with, there was a Ukrainian soldier who was working with the SS who was honored in front of the Canadian Congress recently. And I thought, didn't anybody who was honoring him, who was cheering, didn't any of these guys realize that if he was fighting Russia during World War II, he was with the Nazis? So what we have done is we have sent over $100 billion to the most corrupt country in Europe. And you've got Sweden, and you've got Denmark, and you've got Poland, you've got the UK, you've got France. France just sent several thousand soldiers to Ukraine. And what the Russians do, they kill them.
Mhm.
Okay, of course they're going to. So we're doing some really stupid things, and we're doing things that there is nothing you can possibly gain. But of course, we're doing it for the benefit of the military industrial complex. And what Iran just proved was all these weapons from the US and Israeli military industrial complex, they don't work.
Mhm. Well, Bob, as you're talking about the amount of dollars that are being spent here, how can the US keep sending all of these aid packages all over the world? It seems like every other week we hear that there's another, 10 billion, 20 billion, $5 billion package being sent. How can they keep doing that, and how sustainable is it?
Well, people are starting to wake up, and the Speaker of the House is having a real problem. He's trying to jam through this aid package for Israel and Ukraine, and the Republicans and some Democrats are saying we don't want any part of that nonsense. The United States is bankrupt. We're going to realize it very soon. The people at the ground level actually understand it now, but the people in Washington are utterly clueless.
So, Bob, let's turn back to talking a little bit about gold and silver here. When we look at the structure of the market and we don't see much volume, does this mean that there aren't any sellers, which is actually positive for a lot of these companies?
Well, it means two things. It means there's no sellers, and it also means there's no buyers. And both are very good indicators. Literally, and this is something I rarely talk about because I don't want to give all my secrets away. When there's no volume, that's a great time to buy. And when there's a lot of volume and a lot of liquidity, that's a good time to sell. I ignore interest rates. I ignore currencies. I ignore the stock market. I ignore Bitcoin. I don't care. What I'm interested in is sentiment. You don't have to know anything about gold or silver or oil or the S&P or anything to invest in it profitably if you will measure sentiment. And certainly lack of liquidity is a really important indicator. I've been watching that lately, and I'm watching gold go up $40 in a day, and it's some great stock sells 5,000 shares. And I think this is ridiculous. So sentiment is saying we are overdue for a correction. I hope there's a correction because it would make for a healthier market. However, the basic underpinnings of gold and silver are far better than anybody recognizes, and the prices are going to go up a lot higher and a lot longer than the average people understand. Relative to the S&P, commodities are the cheapest they've ever been, and relative to commodities, gold and silver, the cheapest they've ever been, and relative to gold and silver, the resource stocks are the cheapest they've ever been. Now, if you want to make money, all you have to do is invest when things are cheap. And then when they get expensive, sell them. And it is literally that simple. And everybody wants it complicated. Well, yeah, but what about interest rates? What about the US dollar? What about Biden? What about Trump? Well, none of those have anything to do with it. If you will buy cheap and sell dear, and that's sell DEER, you'll make money.
Mhm.
Tom,
It just sounds so simple.
That was a joke, Tom. I don't think you caught that.
Of course not, Bob.
Sell deer, DEER.
Mhm.
Okay, next time I'll have people. I'll say, Tom, this is a joke. You can laugh now.
Bob, as we're talking about sentiment here, how do you try to measure it? Is it just in the volumes? What are some of the different pieces that you're taking into account that help you measure sentiment within the industry?
The single best sentiment indicator that I'm aware of is the daily sentiment index. Uh, I've written about it many, many, many times, and it tracks 40 commodities, including gold and silver. The problem with it, of course, it doesn't track sentiment on gold shares. However, there are so many indicators of sentiment, and you just picked up one. Volume is a dead giveaway, period. Okay. When there is no volume, there's nobody who's being forced to sell, and there's nobody who's eager to buy, and that's a good thing. You want a really, really boring market because you go from a boring market to an excited market. The VIX is a great indicator if you're dealing with shares. When the VIX gets below a DXY of 10, something is about to happen and it's going to move it. Now, when the VIX moves up to 40 or 50 or 60, everybody's excited. They're either in a panic and selling or they're in a panic and buying. Okay. Humans are herd animals. They want to do what everybody else is doing, but the mob is always wrong in investments. So all you have to know is what the sentiment is. One of the interesting sentiment indicators is to go to Google and do a word search of how do I invest in gold or how do I sell gold, and see what people are looking for. If you can measure what people are doing, if you do the opposite, you'll make money.
Yeah, that's I think a really interesting point to consider because, when we see these excited times, when we see people, FOMOing into some of these different asset classes, that's where I think the real time to be cautious and start to sell really comes in. And, we've had many examples of that, let's say in the last 5 years from cryptocurrencies. Regardless of how you feel about cryptocurrencies, even if you use them as a lesson, I think that can be very valuable.
Oh, absolutely. And we just had a rocket ship higher in the Bitcoin and the 1,000 knockoffs in the last 2 or 3 months. And I absolutely use that as an indicator. And Bitcoin shot up to 72,000. It's gone back to 64. That's a 15% drop. And it's a 15% drop in a week. Okay. When I was talking about 2024 being a very dangerous year, there is so much. We're in the most unstable market I have ever seen, and there are going to be giant rallies and giant crashes. It's a very, very dangerous time. And you absolutely, Rick Rule says that you're either a contrarian or you're a victim, and he's absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Bob, I'd like to, switch over to talking a little bit about how, the East has really driven a lot of this market. And if you think that the shift to China really starting to control the gold price is going to be, a net positive for this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the crazy thing is that with the price of gold and silver going up, where typically the ETFs would be increasing their purchases, they were doing exactly the opposite. And that's a giant sentiment indicator. Now, I'm trying to get somebody to come up with a widget for showing the Shanghai gold and the Shanghai silver price. I can give you the website, and you go to Shanghai and you can scroll through and you can find out where the price of gold is, but the price of gold is in yuan per gram, and then you have to convert that to yuan per ounce, and then you have to convert that to US dollars per ounce. I want somebody to come up with a widget, but there's been this market shift where the Chinese are buying with both hands. And an interesting thing there is that is a negative vote for U.S. treasuries and the U.S. dollars. And if the Chinese sell all their treasuries, interest rates are going to go far higher in the United States, and Americans are just not ready for it, and they're not used to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely not used to it, but considering how this market has held together in the face of these higher interest rates for way longer than I think anybody expected, I think that's an interesting counterpoint to all of the fear that was based around having higher interest rates.
Well, the fear is very real.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you do the math and the difference between a 2% mortgage and a 7% mortgage, you realize that when you've got a 7% mortgage, and at base, I'm 77, a 7% mortgage was a cheap mortgage. It was a good mortgage. Okay. You talk 10, 11, 12%, those are expensive mortgages, but you end up paying far more in interest than you pay for the house. And of course, the real estate market hasn't come to grips with it. I had a piece of paper someplace. Let me see if I can find it. I saw something that I wanted to bring up with you. Probably can't find it now. I found it today, and there was a AT&T building that sold for $3.5 million, down from
in St. Louis.
Yeah.
In 2006, I believe it sold for something like $200 million or $300 million, and it just sold the other day for $3 million.
$3.5 million. Yeah. It had a 98.5% decline. And what everybody would like you to believe is that's some kind of anomaly. And I don't think it's an anomaly at all. I think the commercial real estate is an accident waiting to happen. I think it's going to be far worse in 2008. And of course, I happen to be a nervous Nelly, but I think being a nervous Nelly today is a very sober, sane approach. Mm-hmm. But when real estate's going down, commercial real estate's down 98%, you got a problem.
Mm-hmm. Bob, is the fact that the base metals, copper, lead, zinc, have all been surging higher in recent weeks also an indicator that we're headed for a bigger conflict?
No, it's an indicator that the commodities are far too cheap. And I own a piece of the 8th largest silver mine in the world. And the primary product there is actually zinc. And zinc's gone from $1.09 to $1.26. And of course, nobody pays any attention to it, because why would they? Mm-hmm. But going from 109 to 126 is a really big move, and they've done it in 2 or 3 weeks. My belief is it's not geopolitical in nature. My belief is that people are waking up, that the Dow and the S&P and Bitcoin and the AI stocks are overvalued, and the commodities are undervalued, and money is gradually shifting into them. Now, what's going to happen is eventually, after the commodities have gone up 50 or 100%, ordinary investors are going to start investing. Copper is up to $4.30. That's a lot of money for copper.
Mm-hmm. So, when we take all of these things into consideration that we've spoken about today, Bob, what are some of the most, important developments to be paying attention to at this time to help the average person that is trying to keep a handle on this space understand what is happening?
In a way, it's a very negative thing. Somebody stayed with me recently who has her pulse on the economy in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And ordinary people, including Blacks and Latinos, are looking at the United States giving so much money away, and looking at people crossing the border, and looking at the total chaos and corruption in the United States, saying something's wrong. We need to change this. I think that ordinary people are becoming aware because they see how dangerous the situation is. I mean, we've got the most corrupt administration we've had our nation's history. We've got a former president of the United States on trial for paying off a hooker. And thank God, paying off a hooker, I found out it's perfectly legal. But I sleep a lot better at night knowing that. But we got problems, and the key is before you solve a problem, you got to identify it. So there's lots of problems we could identify. I frankly do not understand the insanity of bringing 10 or 12 million illegal immigrants into the United States. Nobody's ever tried to justify it. They're just trying to do it. And I suspect the Democrats are saying, well, we got caught with all the fake ballots, so we'll just have fake voters now. But something's going to break, and that's not going to be a good thing. When we get through it, we're going to be a lot better off. But this was predicted in the fourth turning, and we either go to full-blown totalitarianism or we go to freedom. And people are waking up and saying, okay, we'd like to have freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So on that note of people waking up and wanting freedom, is there anything that gives you, reason to be optimistic at this time?
Tucker Carlson. Seriously, I mean, I love the idea of a guy coming out and talking honestly. Okay. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean I have to agree with every single thing that he says, mm-hmm. but I am so tired of being lied to by the government, by the media, by the, elite, that it's refreshing to have somebody come out and be honest. And, mm-hmm. and the really amazing thing was they didn't like what he was saying, so they fired him and they turned him into a billionaire, okay, because there's a lot of people who want to hear mm-hmm. somebody being honest. They don't have to agree with it. There's lots of people that disagree with me. I disagree with me all the time, okay, but at least I'm honest about it.
I think the tricky time when you're doing that is when you do it out loud, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I had a recent conversation and we were discussing the idea of the lost art of diplomacy. And you bring up Tucker Carlson in this idea of having conversation with people. And I think that brings a certain humanity to, somebody even like Putin when he interviewed Putin recently. I think it's important to rehumanize and try to understand the other side. And I think a lot of the conflicts and the fear in the world could be solved by something as simple as trying to sit down and have a conversation and finding that common ground with a lot of these people that we are constantly told and scared by, just showing that we have a lot of common ground.
Well, the amazing thing is, and I love Putin because Putin is like Tucker Carlson. And I will say something, I criticize Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson was taken a little bit aback, and he didn't do nearly as good a job of interviewing Putin as he does with everybody else. And that's a power issue. Okay. That was not Tucker Carlson's greatest moment in terms of interviews. You and I were talking about this earlier. The quality of an interview has nothing to do with the person being interviewed. It has everything to do with the person doing the interviews. But Lavrov, okay, is a great moderator. The Chinese have gone to Israel, they've gone to Iran and said, look, do not escalate this further. That's what diplomats are supposed to do, okay? Now, what have we done in Ukraine? We've done exactly the opposite. We've told Ukraine, don't talk to the Russians. Wait a minute. Okay, you've got to talk to your enemy. You've got to find out what the common ground is, find out what they really want. The war in Ukraine was actually won by Russia in March of 2022. Mm-hmm. And Ukraine and Russia sat down in Turkey, and Ukraine actually initialed an agreement that would take the borders back to what they were prior to February 24th. And then, of course, Boris Johnson goes over there and says, no, you don't want to get along with those guys, okay? We'll give you billions more that you could steal, okay, as long as you keep fighting. to keep fighting is not how you win wars. You do something to convince the other guy, okay, that he shouldn't be fighting anymore. We had this incredibly stupid war in Afghanistan for 22 years, and I was looking at it saying, this is nuts. The Washington Post actually came out with a series, and they had interviewed a lot of generals and a lot of politicians, and all these guys were candid. There was no way the United States ever was winning that war, and there was no way they were ever going to win the war. Yet it continued for years past that, and then Biden screwed up the retreat so much, left billions of dollars equipment. There were pallet loads of shrink-wrapped $100 bills, and they didn't even have room on the airport or on the airplane for $1 billion $100 bills. We have to go back to diplomacy. We have to go back to discussing very real issues. There are very real issues between Gaza and Israel. Mm-hmm. And how do you sort it out with tanks or airplanes or 2,000-pound bombs? And the answer is you don't unless you kill them all. Mm-hmm. If they sat down and talked, there could be peace. And the Russians have always been willing to sit down, and the Ukrainians wouldn't, because they were being allowed to steal as much as they could. Ukraine's the most corrupt country in the world. Mm-hmm. Okay. Why would you get into bed with the most corrupt country in the world? The answer is money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of these conflicts, just when we take a step back to try to understand why they're happening, it doesn't make sense from the story we're being told. You know, the incentive structure and the money that's involved, I think, is far more indicative of the real reasons that these conflicts continue.
Well, I can't remember who, I could look it up, but a former CIA director said that they would know the CIA was successful when 100% of what Americans believed lie. And we've got this interesting problem now because of you and people like you, and because of Tucker Carlson and people like Tucker Carlson. People are waking up to the fact that they've been lied to about everything. They were lied to about 9/11. They were lied to about the GFC. They were lied to about COVID. They're lied to about Ukraine. They're being lied to about Israel and Gaza. And they're waking up to the fact, wait a minute, how can you do anything that makes sense? How can you conduct business? How can you invest when everything the media is telling you is a lie? And frankly, it is that simple. Everything the media says is a lie.
Well, you know, it's interesting to see this rise of what we should just call, I guess, the alternative media. And, you know, as much as I do agree with you, Bob, that it is serving a very valuable purpose, there's also, you know, parts of it that I think do give us a lot of mis or disinformation, as much as I don't, you know, necessarily like those terms. Maybe false information is better, because there does seem to be a lot of conjecture at times. And I think a lot of this is due to really the fog of war. There are a lot of opinions that maybe are misinterpretations of what is actually going on, but I don't think, you know, net that ends up being a bad thing. I think we need all of these voices to be a part of the conversation. And that way we can, as long as we're, you know, trying to take several sides into consideration, we're having a better conversation and a better way to kind of triangulate our position in the world, rather than just being spoon-fed what this mainstream media wants us to believe.
Well, it's one of those good news, bad news stories. Mm-hmm. Okay. The bad news is everything the mainstream media tells you is a lie, 100%. And the good news is the alternative media, only half of what you're told is a lie.
Yeah.
So would you like to be told half the truth, or would you like to be told 100% the lie?
Mhm.
Steve Jobs was reported to have said that the greatest thing about the internet was that it gave everyone a voice. And the worst thing about the internet was it gave everyone a voice. Uh, I absolutely I want, and I say this again and again and again in my book. I want people to understand there are no experts, there are no gurus, they're just guys with opinions, and they have to learn to ask questions, and they have to learn to think for themselves. The education system in the United States the last 50 years has gone so far downhill. Our children are being indoctrinated now. They're not being taught, they're being indoctrinated. And you see it with climate change. 1,603 scientists, including two Nobel Prize winners, have come out with documents showing that climate change is rubbish. It used to be global cooling. And somebody did a study and realized that 97% of the predictions from global cooling were fiction. And then they changed it to global warming. And somebody did another study and found out that 97% of the predictions were fiction, never came true. So what whoever it is that controls this said, well, we'll go to global warming, or we'll go to climate change, because you can't argue with climate change. And of course, the beauty is the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the climate has changed every year for 4.5 billion years.
Mhm.
But climate change is fiction. Governments are doing things that are incredibly self-destructive, and life is going to be far more expensive and far more brutal in the future because of government policies based on something that's 97% fiction. And the very few young people who are learning, or somebody is bothered teaching them to think for themselves, are only now beginning to wake up and realize they've been lied to. I mean, if I had one message I would want to give, I'd want to tell people 100% of what the media tells you is a lie. So whatever they say, you just realize the opposite is true.
Mhm. Well, I've had this discussion several times on the show, and I think learning how to think rather than being told what to think is far more important. And I think it's almost in line with our discussion on the art of diplomacy. It's something that is dying, and we need to help and do our best to give people the resources on learning how to think.
Well, frankly, I've written two books on finance and investing, and I think I'm very good at that. I am not a guru. I'm not even an expert. There are some things I've got a lot of knowledge of. I spent almost 2 years at war, so I've got a pretty good handle on what war is and what's good about it and what's bad about it. But I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not a guru. And when I see people trying to self-identify as gurus, I know I'm dealing with somebody who's a fraud.
Mhm. Well, I think we can add crystal balls to the list of things that don't really exist along with gurus.
That would be so.
Excellent, Bob. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up today's conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners to think about?
Well, I hope they've understood from this conversation. This year is going to be a very brutal year in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of good things, but there's far more bad things that can happen. And if you were ever going to learn to think, this would be a great year to learn to think for yourself.
I couldn't agree more with you, Bob. Of course, anybody that wants to, learn more about what Bob is looking at on a daily basis, that's all available at 321gold.com and 321energy.com. And if anybody's interested in reading your books, they're all on Amazon, right?
Yeah, and I've got about 10 books, and I'll let my ego speak for just a minute. I have written everything from 2-hour fiction to a, a book about war and a book about ferrying airplanes all over the world, and a couple of books on investing. And regardless of what your interests are in reading, I've written some really interesting books, and they're very readable. And you don't have to believe me; just look up the reviews, and they're very positive. And I'm quite proud of the books I've written.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, Bob, we'll check in with you in a couple months here and see how things are developing here.
Couple months. Couple months. I thought you loved me.
That doesn't change my love for you, Bob. We just
Okay,
don't.
Tom.
We just like to keep the content fresh, right?
Well, you do an excellent job, and I'm really honored and I'm proud to be on Palisades Radio.
Thank you, sir. The feeling's mutual. Take care.
Okay, thanks, sir.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.